welcome to our panel discussion. I'm here with Marty, Anne, and Justin. We're going to be discussing systems and supply chains within the product and material life cycles. So while we know there's many places to intervene within a system, it can often be challenging for companies to understand where that is and where they can make the most impact to drive change throughout their supply chain and the larger system of the product life cycle. What are some strategies that companies can use to prioritize sustainable decisions?
Well, there's a lot of different ways of answering that, depending on what kinds of drivers those companies are responding to. So, as we'll be talking about in some of the other sections of this discussion, several key drivers are consumers are finding access to a lot more information about chemicals and a lot more research about the harms of chemicals in products and materials. There's a lot of drivers by retailers. Retailers and people who make final products are starting to push on their supply chains and saying, what's in the chemical or product that you're providing me that I'm now putting in my end product and putting out into the market. Increasingly, there are more regulatory drivers than there have been with REACH in Europe and with TSCA and state legislation on specific chemicals as well as chemicals more comprehensively in the US. So those are some of the key drivers. And then we're also seeing investors starting to say that if you're in an industry segment that is dependent on chemicals that are likely to be regulated in the near future, that you are not a good investment going forward. So those are some of the key drivers that we're seeing. So those would probably drive companies to prioritize certain things within their products. So if you are a consumer-facing brand, for example, you're going to be driven a lot more by what consumers are concerned about in your products than some of the others. Whereas if you're a component manufacturer, you're going to be driven by the final product manufacturer that you're selling to.
I think also what can help to prioritize decisions and actions is companies can reach out to different consortiums or learning communities. Mm-hmm. At Northwest Green Chemistry, we've sought to develop a product toxicity assessment roundtable with a few big names, and I think this sort of learning community can help people understand other companies' perspectives and what tools they've used so that they can come to agreed upon decision or make changes that make sense for the particular material that they're working with.
Yeah, one of the other things that we've seen as investors going out and talking to both the incumbent players as well as the new startups is we found it really helpful to take within a sector what are some of the themes where there's a lot of momentum right now. Mm-hmm. So in addition to thinking about, okay, what are the chemicals that are most of concern, also layering onto that, what are some of the other life cycle impacts? So one of the things that we've seen, say, in the textile and apparel sector is water is both a problem in terms of its use, but it's also the carrier for a lot of the chemicals of concern. Sure. So if you can address, use a technology that addresses water use, but also uses a safer type of chemistry and doesn't have any emission of that chemistry into the environment, all of a sudden that's a new technology that's going to have multiple drivers mm-hmm. supporting its adoption mm-hmm. within the industry. And it also takes the conversation beyond just chemists. It takes it into the manufacturing realm, into the design realm, and that's good because as investors, but also as people just trying to promote a better world, we want to have as many options on the table as possible. So we found grouping those things by sectors and drivers within each sector of the economy to be really valuable.
That makes sense. And I think to Justin's point, thinking about leveraging, like within an industry, if we think about electronics industry, leveraging what other companies are doing and what kind of drivers are within that already, and then looking to other key players to kind of adopt some of the things that are working for them. So with that, do we see any initiatives that are bringing industries together to kind of talk about best practices and how to affect sustainable change within their supply chains?
There are both within sector and across sector. So the two cross-sector groups that I'm familiar with, and I think my colleagues here are as well, are the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council. And while there is a lot of benefit, no question, about working within your own sector, because you have a lot of the same core chemical problems and supply chain communication issues, it's really helpful to talk within Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, for example, with leaders in other sectors, because you find that there's a lot of stuff that can be abstracted out, particularly in terms of communicating up and down the supply chain. There's a lot more in common across sectors than one might imagine, so that's one. The other place is the Biz NGO Roundtable for Safer Materials and Chemistries, and that does both within sector and within materials classes work. So the plastic scorecard, for example, is something my colleague Mark Rossi and I put together, trying to evaluate the hazards of input chemistry in polymers. So a lot of work is happening there within the sector as well.
Well, and the plastic scorecard is a great example of that. Could be leveraged by many different industries, right?
That was our intention, yeah.
So those kind of tools, and then benefiting a lot. So one of the things too is really, so it sounds like there's some initiatives that are driving communication. I've also heard that trying to work with your supply chain, especially with how diverse supply chains are getting these days, is what kind of strategies could be needed, or what efforts to really reinforce communication and understanding of what's happening. So if you're thinking about, I'm a manufacturer of an electronic product, a mobile phone, and then how do I know how it's being recycled or what's happening down there? How do I know what those actors are doing within my supply chain? And kind of how would I control that or influence it positively? So thinking kind of about, I think first thinking how we can really improve communication through that, kind of what kind of initiatives could really help understanding what decisions are made.
Well, you talked about managing end of life. That's part of it. One initiative that I thought was pretty cool was that happened in Seattle. I think they recently mandated that plastics be a certain color for whether it's biodegradable or recyclable. And so in that way, it sort of creates an indicator for the consumer to be able to manage it in the correct way. So there's that sort of thing that could help inform the consumer. I think education is important. Yeah, that's one way.
Within the supply chain, there's some nice examples that can potentially be abstracted within the built in products environment. There's something called the Healthy Product Declaration, which the intent there is it's a way to share a bill of materials along with the associated human and environmental health impacts along the supply chain. So it's a format that everyone can fill out and transmit up and down the supply chain, so that while it might have more information than any one person needs, it has all of the information that someone would look for, and it's in a standardized format so that you can find things quickly. I think the other tool that's been really powerful within sectors is consortia coming together to either agree on things like manufacturing or product restricted substance lists. So you see this a lot in the apparel industry. You have a Sustainable Apparel Coalition and the Zero Discharge of Hazardous Waste, the ZDHC Coalition, both of whom have kind of come together around sets of chemistry that they're interested in. You see similar sorts of lists coming out of health and beauty. So there's those are another tool. They're a crude tool, but it's a tool that starts getting people to ask the questions that my colleagues are talking about.
And those are specific within sectors to certain kinds of chemistries and hazards. But there's also just communicating data on chemical data up and down the supply chain. And there's a couple of great examples of that. One is the IMDS from the automobile industry. And you were asking earlier, how do you start making an impact on your supply chain? And I think that's where it's helpful to have a sector-wide consortium. So 20-some years ago, the auto industry got together and said, look, we all have the same suppliers, and we're all asking them the same questions about the chemicals and materials they're giving us. So let's put it all into one database. It's easier for the supplier, and you're more likely to get more accurate information. And it's not something you don't really want to be on the market, you don't want greater toxicity to be part of your market differentiation. So that's something that you don't really have to worry about sharing within your sector. So that's a key thing, really come together within a sector to try and find chemical information, consistent chemical information.
Yeah, it's been amazing in the places where it's been implemented. Just that act of gathering and sharing the information often leads to better decisions being made. Things like harmful carbon black pigment that weren't necessary being taken out of products because no one had asked why it was in there, and a lot of the people didn't even know it was in there. And so out of certain products, just this act of disclosing is enough to start driving us towards a better materials palette.
And then that starts interacting with the regulatory drivers. So for example, the State of California Safer Consumer Products Program has put together a list of lists, as it were, of all the things that we can agree across a whole series of sectors are bad actor chemicals. We're missing a lot of information about chemicals on the market, but these are the ones we know about and we know are problematic. So the idea of putting the 2,300 or so chemicals together is that no matter what sector you're in, you can look at that and say, okay, I want to avoid this class of chemicals, so I'm not going from BPA to BPS and having another toxicity issue, that I'm actually shifting away from the less safe chemistries. And that's going to be a consistent market signal across a bunch of different sectors.
And I think that last point is worth reiterating, that whole notion of taking a class approach, so that in the absence of data, recognizing that if the last 3 perfluorinated chemicals you made were all harmful, maybe the next 260 that you make are also going to be harmful.
Yeah.
Those sorts of extensions of class, they're not strong enough to merit regulatory action,
Correct.
but they may be strong enough to merit consideration by a designer or selector of chemistry. So one of the things that we do see, despite the lack of information for some chemicals, is that by drawing analogy, we can be proactive. And so taking a class approach often helps simplify this universe of something like 2,300 chemicals down to 6 or 7 chemical classes of concern. In fact, there's a nonprofit organization called the Green Science Policy Institute who has 6classes.org that talks about 6 of these classes of chemicals that share chemical actions or chemical structures that people might want to avoid.
And frankly, there's classes of materials and chemistries that are problematic across a bunch of different sectors. If we think about adhesives, dyes and pigments, these are going to be problematic whether it's in a textile or a plastic or whatever. So it's interesting to start thinking about it that way and start coming up with alternative chemistries that would work for those different functions.
And I think some of the consolidation too, so you're saying that not every industry is doing it, but you have this class of chemicals and every industry can leverage, kind of going back to even the plastic scorecard, right? Kind of some of that stuff. So I think also thinking about, are there examples of companies that are doing this really well, that are doing material and chemical disclosure with their suppliers and really kind of trying to get the toxics out of their products?
One of the places that we've seen a lot of action, and I think it makes sense because it's such an intimate contact. So personal care, there's a ton more disclosure, even at the consumer level, than you find in other sectors. And what's great is even if the individual consumer doesn't feel empowered to make a decision based on that ingredient list, you have things like the Environmental Working Group Skin Deep database that can help interpret this. And I think that's one of the things that some guys get pushback on, like, oh, people don't have a PhD in chemistry, how are they going to interpret an ingredient list? But when you do that, you find that there are other organizations who do have the technical expertise to help people interpret it. So whether it's something like EWG or the Good Guide, having that ingredient disclosure like there is in health and beauty really drives the consumer empowerment.
So personal care is one sector. We're also seeing it in textiles, footwear, and apparel. Nike is one that's leading Sustainable Apparel Coalition we've mentioned before. There's other groups that are looking at their supply chains and trying to figure out, some of the safer ways of going about material classes. Again, because they're using common material classes, it's easier to look at them across that platform.
Yeah, and another sector is definitely 3D printing. People are eventually going to be bringing these printers into their home and manufacturing inside their own homes. And so they want, at Autodesk, they open source their formula, both for materials developers to be able to adjust their formulas for their printers and to try to understand what potential alternatives exist for the resins that go into the printer, so that people at home using these printers can feel confident that they're not exposing their children or themselves to toxic chemicals.
We're also seeing efforts in the building material industry, as we say, with being driven by the U.S. Green Building Council and some of its standards, the LEED standard. That's a big driver for that industry. And that and auto, I mean, those are the two most complex consumer products that you can think of. They touch all these other supply chains: metal, electronics, textiles, glass, wood, anything you can think about goes into a house or a car.
Yeah. And electronics has been forced to do a lot more because of the metals part of it. So there's now a lot around conflict minerals and rare minerals that's driven a lot of disclosure, maybe not of the entire device, but of components in that device. We know a lot more about it now.
And that gets back to not thinking just about end of life, but where are we sourcing these materials and where are they coming from, right? So thinking about bio-based materials as well. Is there a company that's doing a good job as far as disclosing information, or a supplier disclosing information, chemical ingredient? I mean, I know that when I've worked with companies, that was one of the big barriers, was kind of getting that material information so I could do product assessments or hazard assessments on those kind of chemical ingredients.
So are you saying a company at the end, somebody who assembles the final product, or a supplier?
A manufacturer getting supplier data.
Getting supplier data.
Yeah, so supplier data can be hard to come up with. In cases where you have enough members of a particular industry, so like sustainable apparel or the folks doing healthy product declaration in the built environment, they can often put enough pressure on to get the information out. The other thing is that information is hidden. It's not completely, it might be not available to one tier down in your supply chain, but at some point, if you produce a chemical, you have to at least send a MSDS, or material data sheet, with certain information on it. Now, especially with the new globally harmonized standards, there is less and less that you can leave off that sheet. You can still leave certain things off, but it's decreasing the number of things you can leave off of it. So if you can get back in the supply chain to where you can locate these SDSs, then you're able to build it back up. The problem isn't that the information doesn't exist. The problem is that it's so diffuse and that there's not a driver to bring it back together. So unless you have an infrastructure like the auto industry that helps organize it, it's not that it doesn't exist, it's that whoever you're talking to doesn't have access to it, because whoever they're talking to doesn't have access to it, because it's hidden somewhere.
And as supply chains get longer and more complex, that's harder and harder, and that's true for every sector that we've talked about today. So.
Thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed our videos and panel discussion. You can find out more information on the website for the Berkeley Big Top 10 event.